Good morning, everyone. We're recording this very important webinar today on March 1st, and we have some really exciting, potentially groundbreaking industry news to share through this webinar. For those that are joining us for the first time, AIIA is a for investor, by investor advocacy organization. We're a 501c4 formed in Washington, D.C. and back in 2021. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please do check out our website at www.goaiia.org. Without further ado, we have some industry experts here with us today, and we really wish to highlight some important data that AIIA was able to obtain through our FOIA efforts. Just quick introduction. So I'll be moderating today's session. My name is Ishaan based in Toronto, Canada. I'm a former EB-5 investor myself and a co-founder of the AIIA. Today, we have some preeminent industry experts with us who will be serving as our panelists. We have 4 experts with us with a depth of knowledge of the EB-5 industry. So I'm just going to take a moment to introduce these folks to you. We have with us Brennan Sim, Ahmed Khan, Ishaan, Khanna, and Jeff Kiser. I'm just going to have everyone just quickly provide a 30-second personal and professional introductions of yourselves to allow us to set the context for this.
Hi, guys. I'm Ahmed. I'm a former attorney, also a regional center executive, and I've been in the industry for over 10 years. Thank you so much, first of all, to Ishaan and Sean and AIIA, all the hard work that you've been doing behind the scenes to get this data and really provide a lot of transparency to the EB-5 industry, something that's been missing in a lot of years past. So kudos to you guys for doing a great job, and very excited to be here today and talk more about what all this data means.
Thank you. Brennan, we'll go on to you.
All right. Hi, my name is Brennan Sim. I've been working in the EB-5 industry since 2013, so the past 11 years. Been traveling the world throughout that time and helping investors with their process. Really excited as well about Ishaan and AIIA and Sean getting all this data. I think it's imperative for investors to be able to see what is going on before they are making an investment. This has been a long issue with USCIS for a long time, that they don't release timely data, and it's very confusing. So we're trying to clear things up today.
Thanks. Thanks, Brennan. Jeff, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Kiser. I've been working in EB-5 since 2015. I cover EB-5 all over the globe, so I see how retrogression can affect certain markets more than others. I've been doing this since 2015, so I've seen this really affect the market, not only for EB-5 investors and their particular timeline, but also for EB-5 fundraisers. This is a very, very important topic, and it's really quite great to see an organization like AIIA come through and present us with actual real information. One thing to stress is that this information doesn't just come easy, and it's not really free. So if you are a prospective EB-5 investor, or you are a EB-5 stakeholder, someone in the industry like myself or Brennan or Ahmed, I highly suggest either becoming a member or donating to this organization so that we can continue to have as clear of data as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. That was actually my plug, but you stole it and actually did a pretty good job with it. So thank you for that. Ishaan, last but not least.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Ishaan. If you've seen the previous webinars, you already know a little bit about me. I'm an EB-5 investor. I've been colleagues and competitors with a lot of these people that you see on the screen. So I'm pretty honored to have all of them. I co-founded AIIA, the American Immigrant Investor Alliance, with Sean back in 2021. We've done advocacy work together. We've sued USCIS, and I think the webinar we're doing today is critical, and it's important to investors as well as investment issuers, as well as just folks who are looking to better advise their clients on where to invest and really plan their future immigration by investment strategy. Also, on that note, I'd like to just basically thank everybody here who contributed financially to this. I mean, AIA has been something that I've wanted to do for a while. Advocating for investors and fairness in the system is something that I've always been passionate about. So yeah, with that, we can probably get into it.
All right. So I just wanted to sort of set the context for today. We have a little bit of background just to kind of give those that are watching us for the first time. There might be some technical content being discussed here for somebody who wants to get maybe primer level knowledge. I do recommend they check out our previous webinars. So, we'll go to those slides shortly just for people to be able to find it easily on YouTube and all of our other channels. We'll talk about, really the FOIA efforts that got us access to this data. We already talked about how vital it is for industry participants, market participants, both on the issuer side as well as on the investment side, to have access to the most up-to-date current data, which really affects their life plans. So this is an effort for AIIA that has been going on for a couple of years. And then we know all of you are really waiting to see the highlights of the data that was very recently obtained. So this is really fresh off the press data that we just recently received. And we'll cover that from a few different angles. We'll talk about the supply side story and ultimately build up our thesis towards how does this all impact today's investors and also those that have previously invested and are currently in the backlog of the EB-5 program. And then we'll close it off with some roundtable discussions. So as I said, the background for a lot of this content that's being discussed today, the primer level knowledge, arguably for somebody who's looking at this for the first time, may be a little bit difficult to follow some of this information. So we do recommend for you to go back and if you have the time, go back and watch these previous webinars we've done. So
for those investors who have invested before March 2022 and are looking for an analysis on their wait times, I highly recommend watching this particular webinar. We do want the pre-RIA investors to know, people who invested before March 2022, that we understand they've been waiting for a long time, and absolutely they deserve information as well. So our work with them is constantly ongoing.
And then building up to today's webinar, and I'll again set the highlights for this, the context through our FOIA work, but previously we had obtained data for the pending 526E inventory, but that data was cut off at April. And we were then continuing to work with through our channels, through the litigation channels of our FOIA to obtain the most current up to date. And as many of you viewers know, the US financial year ends in October, so it was very vital for us to obtain data right up to October 2023 to complete out the full picture from when the RIA was first launched up to the end of this fiscal year. So quickly, the context of all of this work, as we mentioned, is AIIA is a for investor by investor organization, primarily funded through donations that we receive from many EB-5 investors across the world. We have three pillars to our organization, three pillars to the work that we do. One of them is focused on education. So if you go check out our website, there's plenty of educational material, both for prospective and current investors. The second and important pillar of our organization is the congressional advocacy work. A lot of that is currently ongoing, but it's really it's on the back burner at the moment, since we have put a fresh effort to into the RIA efforts. That was really leading all of our organizational view of the industry back in 2021. Since then, we've really shifted to our third pillar, which is the administrative pillar of our organization. So all of the advocacy work that we do to make sure that USCIS continues to put out the most current, accurate, and up-to-date information to market participants, so that this industry can thrive and thrive based on real statistics and not promises that different people can tend to make if that data is in fact missing. So the Freedom of Information Act request that we had made had culminated into initially us not receiving any data from USCIS, which is generally typical of governmental responses. Our next step there was to initiate litigation, what's called FOIA litigation. So we did that with the help of our attorneys, the Galati law firm, who I'd like to thank again for getting us to this point. So really with that, I'd like to then take this plane off the ground and let's get into high gear and start talking about all of the data that we received. Just before I turn this to our panelists, just a quick highlight. So these are just some statistics that have been extrapolated from number of petitions received. So as you can see, EB-5 program continues to be a vital source of new foreign direct investment into the United States through this particular channel. So overall, we're looking at the high unemployment category having contributed close to $1.7 billion just since the RIA was officially launched. And then you can see the rest of the numbers. It just goes on to prove that the demand, just from a monetary perspective, is perhaps still continues to far outpace the overall monetary capability of the system to handle this demand in terms of fulfilling those promises for visas. So just these numbers alone, if you look at 1.7 versus the theoretical limitation, just gives you an idea of the scale of the issue that we're discussing at hand today.
For any congressional reps, folks from the USCIS, DHS who've signed up for this webinar, I know are watching this. At this point, the EB-5 has the potential to do a lot of good in this country, but the way the visas are currently allocated limits it from happening. And it's unlikely that this amount of money that you currently see that is being committed and being invested will continue at the same pace if visa relief isn't brought to investors, especially those that have already committed their capital to projects in this country.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Ishaan. So yeah, this is just another way of saying investors are really putting their money where their mouth is as far as preference and desire to relocate to the United States, and just telling the same story that we're about to tell in visa numbers. This is a monetary way of telling the same story, which is the amount of investor capital that's been committed far outpaces the system's ability to deliver on that product that has been promised in return for that capital. Yeah, so with that, I guess, so the way our webinar today is structured, we talk about the demand side, the supply side, and then of course we marry the two together to see where the demand and supply curve meet and what those implications are for today's investors and also for those that are in the pipeline. So with this, I guess we'll lead it off into our first slide.
Sure. And honestly, I'd love to get Emma to join me on this as well as a former immigration attorney. You've been an EB-5 for a long time. You've seen a lot of petitions being filed. When the law was written, this RIA law was written, I think we all saw that high unemployment to the number of visas that are given to high unemployment versus rural is at a 1:2 ratio.
Right.
Whereas over here, we're looking at the exact opposite when it comes to the demand. If you look at the cumulative number of high unemployment versus cumulative number of rural petitions, there's a huge gap in terms of the number of petitions. Not just, it literally is almost 2:1 over here. It's the exact opposite of what the supply is.
Right. And I think we're seeing a little bit, so there's a lot of different factors that contribute to this, right? Clearly at this point, we can't argue that demand is high, right? For both of these, we're seeing an increase in demand every single month, increase in filings every single month. And so that's clear to see that people want this visa, people are willing to invest, and they're just looking for which project kind of suits them best. Now, definitely you kind of see right off the bat that it took a little while for rural to kind of get into the game, right? There wasn't as much inventory. There weren't as many rural projects that were already structured. Whereas I think one of the effects that we saw from the RIA was projects that had previously already been structured and were ready to go that did fall into a high unemployment category, even under the new regulations, were made available to investors. And those got a lot of those early investors kind of at the end of 2022 and early 2023, right? Yeah, but now the industry's had
that's why you see this like super steady, line here. Whereas for like urban, like rural, we're seeing like this weird little curve that slants up this way. So
that's exactly right. Right. Yeah. And I wonder, like, so I think that's what's so interesting is like now the industry's had a chance to catch up. This is where we had a lot of our, bulk of the industry kind of waking up, realizing that this product was available overseas and here in the US, and a lot of filings happen. And yet still we see high unemployment clearly outpacing rural by a pretty significant margin, right? So I think that's kind of what we're going to get into today is what are the factors that are contributing to that. But ultimately it's led to kind of an interesting situation where you've got double the amount of capacity in rural, and yet you're seeing double the amount of filings in high unemployment. So it's almost like a 4-to-1 what's it called, ratio of what's going on here.
Misallocation.
Yeah, misallocation. Yeah.
So I mean, if I understand correctly, basically it's telling us two things. And what you're saying is this chart perhaps tells us both investor preferences, but also the availability of existing pipeline projects that were in the marketplace at the time. So therefore, I guess what you're suggesting is, some of that higher, I guess, subscription levels we're seeing to the high unemployment was a function of what was in the market at the time. Is that a good way to summarize that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'd love to hear from like Brennan and Jeff as well in terms of what they're seeing. But definitely, there's a couple of different things that go on in EB-5. Obviously, there's investors here in the States who have taken advantage of the program now that there's concurrent filing. But you have to remember that a vast majority of EB-5 filings still occur overseas, right? And so what are the immigration agencies and the channel partners for every regional center putting in front of the clients out there? And so, yeah, it definitely comes down to inventory and what's available, but it also comes down to educating the markets abroad and saying like, hey, this is the implications of what you're going to be selling, and then here you go, and then go out there and find those investors and give them those options.
And I think the biggest surprise to me in this chart has been since August of 2023. That's when we really started to see 956F approvals on rural projects and I-526E approvals coming in with priority processing. And I was expecting to see a much sharper exponential curve upward in the rural filings versus the urban. And you can kind of still see that urban is just steady going up. And we didn't see that jump here. We're interested to see the next couple months of numbers, but I'm really hard pressed to believe that after these numbers come out right now, that's going to continue, because I have a feeling that we're going to really start to see rural filings ramp up, because like you said, there's a 4-to-1 misallocation of supply versus demand right now. And I think that's really going to wake some people up.
I'm kind of surprised by this graph, seeing the gap that still remains between high unemployment and rural. The momentum certainly appears to be on the side of rural at this moment, and I suspect that once we get the November, December, January numbers, that rural will start to close that gap a little bit. But yeah, I think a lot of partners overseas are starting to realize that rural has these clearly displayed benefits that high unemployment does not.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So hold that thought then, Jeff, because I think that's a good segue into our next couple of charts. Now, there's a couple of you here, in fact, all of you that work for issuers that have global visibility on demand across different countries. So let's go over to our next slide. So these are filings in the rural by country. So maybe I'll keep the ball with you there, Jeff. From your perspective, does this align with the type of demand that you guys were seeing?
Absolutely. Yeah, China has certainly shifted with a focus towards rural in recent months, if not over the last half of last year. And what I would say on this graph is it reflects really the experiences of countries in the past era of EB-5 that also suffered from retrogression. So Chinese investors at a point got up to potentially a 16-year wait time during retrogression. India as well, several years wait time. Even Vietnam got into it for a short period of time in the past EB-5 regime. So we've seen China and India put more of a preference, I think, on rural rather than these other countries. So yeah, this absolutely reflects our experience, and I think it makes total sense as to why.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is called PTSD, right? So definitely, I mean, think about it, right? If you're a concurrent filer in the United States, you're an H-1B, Indian or Chinese person who's basically sitting in a long backlog in the EB-2 or EB-3 category, the last thing you want to do is jump out of one backlog right into another one, right? So you're going to take your chances and go into the category that would give you the best shot at doing that, which is why I think the next slide is going to lead to a lot of kind of surprise, and what I was actually very surprised to see for sure.
Yeah. So Ahmed, do you want to just keep going then with the next slide? What are your observations on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing kind of an extrapolation of the last slide, right? Clearly rural kind of showed what we expected in terms of distribution amongst the different countries that are filing within these categories. High unemployment still embodies that, but I was expecting a lot of these Indian numbers to switch over to rural. Honestly, this was probably the number that surprised me the most, because like I said, I mean, if I was an Indian investor who was sitting in a 70+ year backlog in the EB-2 category with a priority date of like 2019, my first thought is, how do I avoid any kind of backlog in the future? Let me roll the dice in the category that has the most room. And so, obviously this doesn't extrapolate between people who are coming from abroad and coming from within the US, but my thought, and just looking at the market and how many folks had concurrently filed in the last year, I would have thought that we would have seen a lot more of Indian filings in the rural side versus high unemployment. And then similarly with China, right? Again, China's been through this, probably had the worst experience with EB-5 backlogs. And then here, again, the number, I know this is for distribution, and I think I'll let Brennan and Jeff kind of comment on some of these other countries that we're seeing on here. But yeah, I mean, just seeing China also, jump into this category and that's ultimately what's going to lead to a lot of the conclusions we're going to draw later on in this webinar. But yeah, just a lot of interesting kind of numbers here to play with. And yeah, Jeff, Brennan, one of you guys.
I'll say something. I'll say something regarding the India filings, because India over here shows 390 petitions, and the previous slide was 174 for rural. So my theory, as far as why India has such a big number of high unemployment, is also because you have a lot of H-1B filings. A lot of folks who are here on H-1B who do EB-5, and for many of them, they live in cities, whether it's like New York, LA, or wherever, and for them, they would rather invest in projects that they're probably within driving distance of or close by.
I want to close out with Brennan's perspective on some of those global markets as well. Brennan, do you want to maybe just close off this one with your perspective on the other countries that are perhaps emerging countries, usually not well representative on the EB-5 pie?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I agree with what everybody has said here. You can see there's probably a higher percentage of Indians that have been filing in high unemployment because they're thinking, oh, I'm going to get an EAD and a work authorization while I do this from within the US because they're on an EB-2 backlog. So that's why you're seeing these numbers. I think that's, like everyone is saying, that's going to change as these new numbers are coming out and showing how far backlogged the urban category really is already. I'm very shocked by Taiwan. That's really, it's going to be very interesting whether they issue, they're obviously hitting their 7% cap here within the set aside category. So the question is whether they're going to be issued unreserved visas or not. If they hit their 7% cap, will high unemployment investors receive unreserved visas? In India and China, you can't do that because they're backlogged, those unreserved are. The other countries is also interesting to me. I think the biggest thing that happened in the EB-5 industry over the last 6 years is in 2018, China went to a 15-year backlog, and that just killed the market. And so what happened was you saw an exodus of developers who were raising their own capital, mostly in New York City and some major markets around the country, because they were just going and raising all this money out of China with the major Chinese agents who could bring capital like crazy. Back then, the market was almost 90% Chinese. And now in the last 6 years, you see that the issuers of the offering, they are now having to go out to other markets, and they've had to do that over the last 6 years. And they've had to build out more of a sales team and build out a group that can go to India, that can go to some of these other nations that had not really known about EB-5 in the past. And so you can see as we've come back and we had the Reform and Integrity Act, and we've come back to the market, we have a bigger market outside of China just because of awareness. And that's what I'm seeing here. So it's very interesting what's happening here. You can see that we clearly have some issues already in high unemployment, but it is pretty surprising to see, especially India, that you're almost at 2.5 times as many filings in high unemployment as you have.
Yeah.
Okay.
And real quick, and I know we're trying to move off the slide, but real quick, just to add to Brendan's point, I know I said that it was PTSD for Indians and Chinese. It's almost the opposite, right? For the rest of the world, it's almost like a false sense of security. And I think we're about to see that false sense of security has led to some very interesting implications based on the current numbers.
Yeah. Now, for me, and again, just to kind of simplify the takeaway, is it fair to say that most countries, and if not all of them, except India, have generally a high sensitivity because those investors, or towards, I should say, wait times, because those investors are waiting outside the country, as opposed to majority of Indian filings, as I understand, to be from the mainland here, where they may be less, sensitive to that. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a huge factor as to why China is 70% of the rural filings and only 46% of the high unemployment.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, keeping on the China theme then, so it seems to me that the Chinese EB-5 party, if you will, has really sort of reignited here. As you were mentioning, Brennan, it sort of took a hit in 2018. So let's see what the next set of data here tells us. Do you want to, maybe I'll pass this one on to Ahmed. If you want to just take this one on and then pass it on to Jeff and Ishaan.
Yeah, I'll start it off, and I'll definitely want to hear from everybody else as well, because we've got some of the big players in the industry here. What I think is really interesting is the way that China is trending, right? We're seeing it kind of go on this upward trajectory, and there's a lot of factors that lead to this area right here, kind of seeing that big jump, right? one of the things that people have to understand about how Chinese funds work is it takes time to come to the United States, right? People might be thinking like, oh, this is kind of like a 1-to-1 ratio. People decided in March that, oh, I'm going to move forward, and then in April their funds have arrived in the United States. That's just not how it happens. Okay, realistically, what happens is someone in China learns about a project maybe in like February, and then sometime in like July, August, September, their funds actually arrive in the United States because sourcing those funds, transferring them out of China, getting them to the U.S. with the help of the attorneys, it takes a long time. And so a lot of this was built up, right? A lot of this demand had actually been met somewhere maybe here at the end of 2022 and early 2023. And that's certainly something that we've seen where we had people signing subscriptions, committing to funds, committing to projects. I know we saw a lot of rural projects kind of sell out around that same time. And then actually those filings hit somewhere closer to the middle of the year or even closer to the end of the year. And now, we're looking at this graph, and obviously, there's some data that's missing here that USCIS still owes us, or owes AIIA.
Yeah, I'll talk about that bit. So the reason why, so if everyone's like, oh well, the data's sloping off, or there's less petitions here. So guys, we received this data in basically like a few weeks ago, and what happened was, and I think based on our conversations with DHA and USCIS, I think we've sort of understood that it takes time to count the receipts. So for those of you investors who've applied recently and you haven't received a receipt for months on end, it's because they're not counting them efficiently. We did ask for the data up to November, but we do not think that this number that you see here is actually correct. Obviously, there was Thanksgiving, people probably went on holiday and stuff like that. So the reality is that it could likely be somewhere here, but we wanted to show you guys this data because this is exactly what we received. We could have cut it off at October, but this at least at some point in November, we know that these many petitions were put in. So again, just as a reminder, this is the high unemployment filings for China versus the rest of the world. So even though you see this nice big spike over here, with that, obviously, then you can see China crossing over the whole world and increasing to file its petitions from there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is there any seasonality in this data? Maybe one of you can talk about that. Is it normally to have lower December, perhaps having less working days? Is there some seasonality to be expected?
I don't think that these are correct at all. I mean, I'd say the main seasonality is we usually see lesser petitions being filed, especially in the month of July, sometimes in the summer, but you can see it fairly consistent here. But that would be, Chinese New Year in February, you see a drop off in China usually. And then I would say the summer months for the majority of the world that's in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah. I'd say instead of seasonality, you're looking at kind of like specific instances where a project comes to market in some other country. That's what leads to these peaks, right? Some kind of, well recognized regional center enters a market and they sell out very quickly. And that's what leads to these big spikes right here. But yeah, China, to Brennan's point, stays pretty consistent. I do think we did see it come down a little bit in these months. Again, we don't know if this is all of the data, but yeah, I mean, we're expecting, and so Brennan, you brought this point up earlier, and I just want to comment on it. Like, we keep hearing that rural is all of a sudden going to overtake and just be like the majority of filings. I just haven't seen it yet. And I'm starting to feel like it's an assumption that's led to a lot of other things going wrong, right? Like the high unemployment filings and things like that. Like, we got to stop assuming at some point. And I was in that boat, right, where we said, oh, definitely the second half of 2023, we're just going to see a bunch of rural filings from all over the world, China, India, et cetera. And it just didn't happen, right? So
that's what I thought was the biggest surprise to me, like I said, when we were looking at the chart earlier of all the filings. So I think it's a very interesting point. And then, I think that the biggest change, just to get back to the spikes as well, I think that this month of March 2024 will be a huge spike because of the filing fees going up on April 1st. And so there's probably going to be more petitions filed this month than there will be the entire year of 2024. So it'll be really interesting once we get a little further along and we see some data there. And also after this data comes out, we will really see is the market going to finally react to the numbers, like you're saying. Yeah.
Actually, if you think we move to the next slide, I think you will see there was some reaction to the numbers. John, if you want to
Yeah.
go to the next slide.
I will. Yeah. So the next slide really just talks about how much the Chinese have embraced the rural set aside, which Jeff, maybe I want to get you in on this first. I know you guys have some visibility into the China market. Do you want to maybe start off with your reactions?
This is very much in line with what we've experienced. And it would make sense that at the beginning, prior to rural really being processing times for rural were much faster, that they might still be putting an emphasis on high unemployment. But as of now, no, this very recent uptick is very much in line with what we have. And I know that this data for November and December is incomplete, most likely, but we expect that gap will just continue to rise between China and the rest of the world.
I have some theories, which is why like there is a spike, like especially want to talk about this one right here, like why we saw that. So I have two theories. One is that I know a couple of you guys started receiving a bunch of your I-956 and I-526E approvals somewhere around this time, right? And that's why you suddenly saw a huge surge of people being like, wait a second, my friend at XYZ Regional Center just got their 526E approval and he's going to get his green card soon. Let me get into that. And my other theory is, which I'm hoping is more true, is the fact that we released our data from the last webinar right around this time. This is the time, like just basically was like a few months back when we first released the data and we said, all right, up until April, these many filings, this is what the distribution looks like. I think investors started wising up, both from rest of the world as well as from China, when they're like, maybe we should consider this particular thing as well. Obviously, the Chinese have been more on top of it. We can see the spike for China has been huge compared to, say, the spike from rest of the world. But I think it's significant nonetheless.
Yeah, this gap right here is the shocking part, right? Like I think we're all in agreement that China caught on right around here, and yeah, I think the 956 apps definitely had a big part of that. But yeah, this gap right here is what's been most surprising is China figured it out, and we're seeing that meteoric rise that we expected, but the rest of the world seems to kind of be lagging a little bit, and unfortunately, they're going to pay for it because guess what? It's at some point it ends up being priority data over everything, right? Especially if you're Indian. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but
yeah, save that part. Let's save that part for the end because I do have a lot of questions on that. Okay, so then just to round out the China story, what do we see here? I mean, the way I'm reading this data is, the uptake is there, but again, high unemployment up until a certain point continued to dominate, and then as you said, Ahmed, at some point that switch basically flipped, where they kind of started to figure it out. So maybe just continue that story for me there. What's the final takeaway here?
Yep, you see that exactly what Ishaan was talking about, and I think he's spot on with both of those reasons. AIIA definitely released those numbers around that time. Everyone finally got to peek behind the curtain and see what was going on at USCIS. I think in years past, we just didn't have the data, and everyone could just say whatever they wanted in overseas markets, and no one had anything to basically point to discredit that. We finally have transparency. We finally have real data. We finally have, numbers that we can work with. And that educating the market is the best way to avoid, this situation where we end up in a 15-year backlog. So yeah, we see China kind of understand that this is what's going on. We see that switch. And the other thing that I see in this graph is, the demand is there. The demand is definitely there. Speaking to Ishaan's early point about, just how much this program means to overseas investors. It means so much. There's so much money that could be brought into the United States and lift up our economy. There's so much demand here that we could continuously be taken care of if we didn't have these additional limits caused by the way that visas are allocated.
Okay. All right. Well,
I was just going to say, what's
go ahead,
really interesting to me about this data, though, is despite all of this, I mean, we do see that the rural demand crosses over right in August when projects started to receive 956F and I-526E approval. However, there still is a lot of investors here in high unemployment projects from China. I mean, that's a shocking number to me. The fact that I mean, I'm taking out this November and December data here. I don't think that's good data to look at. But the fact that there was still nearly as many filings into the high unemployment category as there was in the rural in the fall that surprised me a lot, and
very surprising,
very detrimental to a lot of these investors.
And Jeff, I'd love to hear your take, kind of like, because we all kind of know the big players, right, in China. And my theory is that the big players who go out and basically find and understand the markets and have been doing this for several years, they understood, right? Like right around here, they understood what was going on. But clearly there was those fringe agencies or the people who maybe, are just looking to place investors, looking to make a name for themselves. They just, they took what they had and ran with it here. And I'd love to hear your take on that because I think you work with a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese, especially the large Chinese migration agents, are incredibly informed on how the EB-5 process works and the potential for retrogression. But they also understand that a lot of what USCIS says and does is theoretical until it actually happens. So until we start to see those I-956F approvals, those I-526E approvals, a lot of it was just words on paper. And now that we're actually seeing those results move forward. I can't say the same specifically for some of these smaller Chinese agents who are just now learning about EB-5 and getting on board. They might not quite understand the difference between high unemployment versus rural and might be putting more of an emphasis on raising for projects in cities that are well known and perhaps more sellable to their investors. I, just like you guys, am quite surprised that the high unemployment numbers were that high or remain that high through August of this year. The agents that we work with are currently putting a major priority on rural. So our numbers are certainly skewed towards rural investors, but the numbers don't lie. China is certainly still pushing out high unemployment.
Yeah, and then from what I heard, I think there's a lot of inertia in the system, the mentality, the education process. What's the type of projects that are being marketed that are already in the pipeline, I think play into this. But I guess that's where having access to this data and providing this timely data back to the marketplace plays a big role to kind of try and like speed up that inertia, if you will, based on the current market signals that the data is sending. So let's now move on to I think we've done a pretty good job analyzing China. Let's go to India, which is obviously a very important market. And then I'm hoping that you guys can use your framework with which you looked at China from, quickly apply that framework again to India, and then we've got a couple other countries to cover. So Ishaan, maybe you want to just take us through the India story?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of obvious things here. So when you look at this thing right here, right, like this big spike in the beginning, that was all the people waiting for the RIA to pass, wanting to get in quickly. The first guy who ever filed the I-526E, who's also an AIIA member, I know he filed. I know he's actually got his approval right now too, and he's got his pending 485. So I understand why this spike happens. I don't really have a good explanation as to like why there is this another second wave spike here, and more importantly, like why it's continued. I totally understand why rural has gone up for India. Like I love this, this nice big chart over here where people it makes sense to me. I mean, I understand why Indians have now focused more on rural because they get priority processing, etc. But what I don't understand is why this trend is continued and why these number of filings here is similar across the board. No real clear answers on that unless somebody else has any theories.
I think this one makes sense to me, right? We're talking about between March and August, before we had any real information, right? This is really when just EB-5 was back, right? So we see that jump. It makes sense. We see it on both rural and high unemployment. Everyone's kind of, going into projects or choosing based on, just their preferences. This to me is the defining line right here, right? This is when we have data from AIIA about how many people have filed. We have information from regional centers getting 956F approvals, from investors getting their 526E approvals. And yet still we're seeing high unemployment continue to outpace. And that signals to me that, some folks are basically putting a little bit more preference on the project and maybe the parameters or the return that they're receiving versus, what might be best for their immigration benefits or whatnot. So definitely a holistic approach that some of these investors are taking. This is India. So again, kind of assuming that there's a high number of filers from within the US. And yeah, I think Ishaan, something that you mentioned earlier that kind of spoke to some investors that I've spoken to is they're wary of rural projects because of the location versus, the familiarity with, big city project or adjacent to big city. But the reality is like the deal structure is what should matter. And ultimately you got to weigh everything, including the immigration benefits and the immigration side of things, this is an immigration-based investment after all. And then also looking at the deal structure itself versus just wholeheartedly saying, oh, just because it's a rural project means it's going to be more risky or less safe.
Right. Okay. So I'm just to kind of round this out, and that has been my perception as well, that I think of all the big EB-5 countries, India being an English-speaking country, responds a bit quicker to sort of market signals. But on the other hand, here, I guess what you're suggesting is that Indian investors in the context of this data seem to have taken a more holistic approach, where they're sort of weighing their immigration benefits against maybe their perceived financial benefits or the safety of those investments in those relative rural versus high unemployment, right?
100%. Folks in America think like Americans, right? Capitalism above all. So you definitely have those conversations much more here in the States than with anyone abroad in terms of what is my return? I want to win this transaction as much as possible. And yeah, I'm doing this for immigration, but I also want to get something else out of it. And then you definitely see those conversations occurring. And I think that's part, again, there's a lot of factors here, but I think that's at least part of what's led to this graph being the way it is.
Okay, well, we're going to move on to Taiwan here next, but yeah, like I guess for me, it'll be a very curious sort of investigation to find out when that switch flips, because I think that would be telling to what is the appetite for an average Indian investor. How long can they seem to wait before they start to sort of downgrade the immigration preference over the financial preference? So I guess we'll stay tuned for that. Let's go to Taiwan, which is really sort of continue that theme of high unemployment continuing to outpace. What's going on here, guys? Like, is the market signal not reaching, or again, is it an inertia story, or what is it? Jeff, do you want to take a crack at
it? Yeah. I mean, my experience in Taiwan is absolutely in line with this graph. There is a perception in the Taiwan market that a rural project equals a significantly riskier project. And given that Taiwan has not been a market that has been, historically scarred by retrogression the same way that certain other markets have, they're still going to put a preference on the project over the visa preference. Now, that might change with this data, but that's currently where we stand. I have been in rooms with Taiwanese investors and, have presented a rural offering to them, and, they have not even begun to consider it because of the stigma that rural projects have in that particular market. So that's something that the market is going to have to get over should rural actually succeed in there. Okay.
Brennan, do you have a view?
I think this was the most surprising data to me in all of it. And I think it's a great segue into some of the discussion we're about to have on supply versus demand and what this is going to lead to for the Taiwanese market. It's very clear that no one in Taiwan is being presented with rural projects, and it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, it's a very agent-driven market. You have basically Korea, China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, which are really the only agent-driven markets. And you can see that there must not be agents who are selling rural projects in Taiwan. So, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see how USCIS starts allocating these visas, because I mean, Taiwan is in a situation right now where, I mean, they might not have a backlog at this moment, but they might have a significant backlog at this moment. Just
Brennan, hold on to that thought, because we want to sort of keep that for our sort of final analysis. But yeah, you're definitely on to something very important there. Brennan, continue with the Korea story for me, because I mean, is it the same sort of preferences that apply in the Korean mindset in your mind? So let's continue that. We'll go to the supply side.
Yeah, Korea is another agent-driven market. It's clear that agents are selling urban projects in Korea. I mean, you can see there was 0 filings basically throughout 2023 in the Korean market. They're obviously not worried about a backlog, and so I think that this hasn't been surprising to me. The Korean market has not been what it was a few years back. Since COVID, the markets there it's been not a very liquid market. It's been difficult to get loans on real estate, very high interest rates, and so it's been a more difficult market over the past couple of years than it was before. Really, when the change happened in 2019, when it went up to 900,000 and then the program shut down.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. So I guess to our viewers, just want to take our attention back to the viewers. So the story that we're really just trying to tell here, everything that you've seen in the last few slides is really just raw data, unmanipulated. All we've done is just presented that data in graphical formats that allow you to sort of easily digest that data. So the segue here from here on out in the way that we're sort of trying to tell the story is this is the demand side equation. How much subscription is happening? Now we need the important consideration here as everything else in life. How much supply is there? So the next segue here into our next section of this webinar is really on the supply side. And I think this is where the conversation gets very interesting because I'd like to hear from each one of you, based on your individual sort of market intelligence, how do these implications play out into the psyche of those individual countries? How would people perceive this data? How would, perhaps we'll take some wagers at the end on what you guys think might happen, in the next data release that hopefully AIIA can get. So with that, we'll move on there. Any other thoughts before we move on into that section?
No,
Let's do it.
So I think the important thing for people to know when we look at supply is understanding that we cannot predict what that future supply of visas will look like. We can look at base cases, but the thing is it fluctuates based on usage and rollovers from other categories. So what you see right now, for example, I think is the clearest explanation of this specific year. So this year is special. This fiscal year is special because this is likely one of those years where we're going to get the maximum number of rollovers, which also goes to one of our advocacy efforts, which is pushing USCIS to adjudicate petitions faster and actually issue as many visas this year as possible.
And sorry, just one quick clarification for the uninitiated. What's the ratio between 11,400? How do we get from 161 to 11,000? What is the share of EB-5 as a percentage?
Well, the visas, EB-5 gets 7% of all the visas allocated to the employment-based categories. The reason why there are more than 10,000, which is the usual yearly limit for EB-5, is because there were consulates that were shut down throughout the pandemic, and there were family-based visas that were not issued that were supposed to be issued. And so those do what's called a trickle down into the employment-based category. And so you see that we have extra visas available this year for EB-5. Now, really, we'll see in the next slide that the number is actually a lot more because we have the rollover visas from last year as well that get added to this allocation. And those are what are going to start to get issued and go away in the next couple of years and significantly reduce the number of visas that we have available, which is why it's so important that USCIS issues as many visas as possible within the set-aside categories this year. I mean, we'll hope with priority processing, we'll probably see a lot more issued in rural than we will high unemployment. But that is a vital number, and that will impact severely what's going to happen in the future with these numbers.
Yep.
I can explain this here real quick. I mean, you see the rural carryover you see in 2024 is right there at about 2,800 visas, 2,799. So you add that 2,799 to the 2,286 that you saw on the last slide, which is 20% of this year's visas. Now, this 2,799 visas, if they do not get issued this year by September 30th of 2024, those are going to get lost and go into the unreserved category. So it's crucial that the amount of rural visas issued this year, it's that will eat into that too. So if let's say we get 500 visas issued this year, that means that we're going to lose 500. That's 2,300 visas that we lose to the unreserved categories from the rural set aside category.
Do we know whether the USCIS would prioritize issuance of the carryover visas over this year's visas to maximize their usage? Is that an official policy that we know to exist?
I mean, I would assume that they would be issuing these carryover visas rather than the 2,286 new visas. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to do it the other way. But at the same time, if anyone from USCIS is watching this, it makes zero sense that set-aside visas are being issued to anyone from any country that is not backlogged on Chart A of the Visa Bulletin. It's just a waste of set-aside visas, and that's how they're going to allocate it. And I think it's detrimental to everyone in the industry. And I don't think it's a fair thing to do. And then the big other question is once you hit your 7% cap, you see in 2024, the 7% cap in rural is 356 visas. It means China's probably hit that cap. India probably has not at 174. They probably have by now, but there still is enough visas within this category to issue all of those rural visas. But if you're from, another country and you hit your 7% cap here within the rural set-asides and you're not backlogged on chart A of the visa bulletin, you should be able to get unreserved visas. And that's a question mark is USCIS going to issue unreserved visas to countries that have hit their 7% country cap in the set-aside, but are not backlogged on chart A of the visa bulletin?
Okay.
But then the counter argument would be is that, hey, if I'm a Chinese investor and I invested in 2016 and I'm stuck in the backlog, maybe I should get that unreserved visa first. So
yeah, but I mean,
debate.
I mean, I think every country is going to always argue for themselves, right? But I do, like, in theory, Brennan's point makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you're in the EB-5 category overall, right, just putting aside the set-asides and things like that, and you're from a country that isn't backlogged overall within that category, you should have a shot at getting a visa. Now, the way that the mathematics kind of breaks down the different subcategories and things like that obviously matters in terms of putting you into a subcategory or whatnot. But the way that the system is kind of done, it's unfair to everyone. Really, just there's no winners in the way that it's currently set up. And unfortunately, a visa for someone is a visa taken away from someone else. That's always going to be the reality, right? A green card for someone is going to be a green card taken away from someone else. And ultimately, we just have to kind of live with that. But what we know is, look, there's a lot, there's still space here in the rural visa supply. I think that's the big takeaway that I take from this. And Sean and Brendan, you guys were kind of chatting about, are they going to use the carryover first or the new ones first? It actually doesn't matter, right? They're not tagging these visas. If they never hit 27.99 in this year that they've used, then yeah, those are just gone, and we have a set number of rollover. It's only going to be the 2286 that roll over, right? If they bleed through the 27.99 and bleed into the 2286, then that number decreases, and we've done a good job and not wasted visas. But realistically, just if they don't even hit that number, it doesn't matter which visa type they've issued. So yeah, I think this really kind of shows exactly what we're talking about here, right? You see as rural petitions kind of, we see the actual number.
Explain the estimated 2x versus 3x. And
yeah. Let's start with that bit first, because I think what you guys, the last slide, for anyone who the numbers and all went all over your head, here's everything we're explaining in a much more visual fashion. Should we maybe start with the supply and then we can go into the demand colors?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Yep. So starting with you're talking about I'll start with the demand colors, right? So the demand, basically, we've got on the very far left, we've got the number of petitions that are actually filed, right? Including all countries, right? Now, from there, we can basically try to extrapolate, and historically, somewhere between 2 and 3 people usually apply per application, right? For China, that number has wavered somewhere between 2.5 to 2.9, depending on the year. I would say usually around 2.7 to 2.8 is a pretty good estimate. For India, it's right around 2.6, 2.7 as well. So, we've kind of given you both options, and somewhere in between these two bars is probably where you're going to end up, right? Maybe like right around here is likely the real number of demand that we're seeing right now, right? Somewhere between 2 and 3. But what we've done is basically said, okay, let's be super optimistic and say there's only 2 people per application, and then let's also kind of be very conservative and look at 3 people per application in the rural category, and then go based off those assumptions, right? So very important to note, these are assumptions that we're basically pulling. Sorry, I covered up the writing there. These are assumptions that we're doing, understanding that every application, and this is one of the ways that EB-5 suffers if you're new to the category, is when you're an H-1B filer, your entire family gets counted as one visa. When you're in EB-5, every single family member takes away from the total visa numbers that are allotted to the category. So it's a lot more painful for those in this category. So yeah, looking at the demand, right? We've taken the number, the base number of petitions right here, and then given you 2 different scenarios in terms of what they could be based on number of applications or based on family members per application. And then
so Ahmed, would you say though that this one right here is the worst case? Hypothetically, 3 visas per petition.
Yeah, we haven't ever
right?
seen, we haven't really historically seen anything going over 3. So I would say that most
I
likely
think
this
I
is the
think
worst case
Vietnam
scenario.
sometimes Vietnam has gone to
Yeah,
three something sometimes. But I think the bigger point here is like if you just take this demand right here and you compare it against the supply for this year or for 2025, we're at a point where really like there is enough supply to take care of this demand. I think that if there's
correct.
is any takeaway to go from this webinar that we're doing is the fact that there is enough visas to go around for everyone with the current data that we have. And this assumes, right, this is the worst case scenario. This is 3 people per petition. This is assuming 100% of those people are going to be approved. And yes, I mean, obviously, this also assumes that these people will actually be approved so that these visas can all be allocated within the next 2 fiscal years. But in an ideal situation, this could be okay.
But
No
but
one should
and that's the
raise
other exactly, and the other thing that you just brought up, right, about the approvals, there's a high likelihood that they actually get approved on time because it's rural and it gets priority processing. And we've seen industry wide, regardless of regional center, regardless of project, we're seeing 12-month approvals, and even faster than that. We've seen 6 months, we've seen 2 months, we've seen 3-month approvals. So yeah, this is the category where you can really kind of nail down the timelines of those approvals, when those visas will actually be needed. And yeah, to your point, exactly, the first 2 years of that availability is more than enough to satisfy the demand.
And I just want to clarify just one assumption that was made on this that I think is correct. I think everybody would agree with me on here, is that in the fiscal year 2024, we will lose a portion of those visas to the unreserved category. At least the rural set aside will lose that. And so some of those visas in the fiscal year in the supply there are not going to get issued to the set aside category. They're going to go to the unreserved. However, in fiscal year 2025, I think especially with priority processing, like Ahmed said, we should see all of the visas issued in 2025 from the amount of demand that we've had since the RIA was passed. And so that's why you see such a significant drop off in visa numbers into 2026, is because the assumption there is that all of the visas here for rural are going to get issued in 2025. So there won't be any rollovers into 2026. However, we definitely should use all of the visas that roll over from 2024 to 2025 next year. And so if we don't use all the visas there on the 2025 chart, all the remainder of the visas should get added to that fiscal year 2026. So you do see there really is significant supply right now to cover all of this rural demand.
So guys, just to kind of round this out, what you're saying is the next 2 years are perhaps exceptional, right? Because there's the rollover visas. But if you look at the stabilized situation and if you extrapolated this past year's demand into stabilized supply, we're almost at that match, or perhaps already outstripping that. So what we're saying is, yes, they will get, visas over the next couple of years because of that exceptional rollover situation. But the program overall at this point is still not sustainable from a rural perspective when you start looking out into sustained, long-term supply.
Absolutely. We're good right now. We're not going to be good in the future. We still are definitely leading toward a backlog, especially for China, and India is coming. But at the moment right now, I think we can derive from this that there is enough supply for the current rural demand. But like you said, once we get into fiscal year 2026, every year all those visas should be used. So there shouldn't be rollovers anymore. And that 2,000 will be the fixed supply. And that's where you're really going to start to see
it's brutal. That's brutal. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Let's go over to the we got to really get through the next one here, which is really where we're seeing most of the most recent demand come in is the high unemployment category. So let's look at the situation on the high unemployment side, which I think is seeing a lot more stresses. So these numbers basically follow the same logic that you guys saw on the rural side. The mathematics is all the same. The only difference is that instead of 20% rural numbers, 20% of allocation, you get 10%. But there still seems to be some rollover visas. So again, maybe that exceptional situation that we talked about continues. So let's just jump right into the demand versus supply scenario there. Ishaan, do you want to just maybe start us off?
So this is where things get tricky, right? Because if you look at it, like let's just look at our like our base, the number of petitions is here. Right now, if we were to assume that all of these people get approved, and even let's just say that we're at a point where there's 2 visas per petition, we can clearly tell there's going to be a backlog. Not everyone from China is going to make it through. Possibly not everyone from India is going to make it through either. So it is likely that there may be priority dates for those specific countries in the high unemployment category. With that said, the part that scares me more, and it's not certain yet because we don't have approval rate data, we don't have dependent data, we don't know if these petitions will be approved fast enough. What I'm more concerned about, and we'll get into this through our discussions, is the fact that high unemployment could have a global priority date, meaning for all countries. Because let's just say we're at a point where all other countries, China, India, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, are all using up their 7%, then there may be a point where there just won't be enough visas to go around as a whole.
Okay, and what's the implication? Are you guys suggesting the implications are the same on the rest of the world demand as well? But this is more of a, basically we're focusing on the orange bars and the blue bars from a 7% perspective. But how do we extrapolate this? If I'm from Canada, for example, what should I be watching out for?
Yeah, and I think, go ahead, Brendan.
I mean, I think the major thing to really take from here is, yes, you already see there's more applicants from rural, there's more applicants from India and China than there are even visas available within this set aside category. So
in aggregate,
you're already looking there, you're already seeing that there's a significant backlog. From Canada, at this point, you're probably not looking at a backlog. But what Ishaan is discussing is that if you get to a place where there's a certain amount of countries that are all nearing that 7% of their visa category, and just by issuing 7% of the visas to a plethora of countries, that takes up and eats up all the visa supply. That's where you run into a real issue. But I think the real issue here is not having priority processing. The fact that we are hardly going to have any people that have invested already in urban high unemployment that are going to be issued green cards this year before September 30th of 2024. We're going to lose a lot, most likely most of those 1,400 rollover visas from last year to the unreserved category, whether all the visas get issued in 2025. And you can see that this amount of demand doesn't just stack up to 2024. It's stacking up over toward where the fiscal year 2026 supply is. And maybe you have some rollovers from 2025 into 2026. But then by the time that most of these investors in these projects are getting to the stage of where they're going to be issued a visa, your supply is at less than 1,000 visas. And we already have a couple thousand applicants. And that's where it's really dangerous. And that's where you could potentially run into the issue that Ishaan is talking about, where we backlog everywhere.
Right. And then to kind of summarize both those points that Ishaan and Brendan just really articulated is USCIS, or really the way that the visa bulletin changes is by Department of State. And those numbers only change when there are approvals. And unfortunately, what that leads to is a lot of waste in these two categories because approvals just aren't catching up with the number of filings. But what you do know, and so unfortunately, this is the year where things go wrong, right? This is the year where people start seeing approvals. Fiscal year 2026 is basically when everyone's going to be waiting in line for a green card. And guess what? We wasted half, if not more, of the available green cards and visas here in fiscal year 2024 and 2025. And now there's really only the 1,000 or so left in 2026. And so when this bar graph starts having as many colors as it does, like historically, we've seen China and India really and even Vietnam at one point, suffering because they were the majority filers and there was a very small percentage left over from other countries that they were using, and then it was allocated back to China. Well, guess what? Everyone started from scratch in 2022. Everyone's been filing at a much higher rate. And to Brennan's point earlier, people are going out. They're not relying on just China to fill up their projects. And as the rest of the world as the rest of the world kind of starts filling up those numbers and taking away from China and India, there's a conceivable future where China and India are only getting 70-ish visas out of this category because everybody else has used up a lot of this. It doesn't take a lot of applications. I mean, let's put this in real numbers, right? We're talking about 70 visas per country. 10 countries taking up 70 visas is 700 visas gone from that year. It doesn't take a lot.
That's only 25, 30 filers, if that.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
the only thing that I see that gives relief to this is, like I said earlier, and I know that this is probably hard for a lot of people to understand, but if they start allowing non-Chart A backlog countries, so not India and China, if they give unreserved visas to people in other countries that hit their 7% cap within this category, that's the only factor that gives a little bit of relief. Because what that means is that, okay, if it's 70 a year, and let's say Taiwan or Korea hits their 70 visas, are they going to say, okay, well, Taiwan and Korea are allocated 7% of all of the visas, so we're going, since you're not backlogged and you don't have people with earlier priority dates in the unreserved category that need those visas now, are they going to issue up to the 7% of the total fiscal year visa numbers to those countries that have hit their 7% cap within the set aside?
But to be clear, let's say that they do that, right? That helps those countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, who are just kind of joining the party. Guess who it doesn't help at all? It doesn't help Indian filers. It doesn't help Chinese filers. The big two, I mean, they've already hit that point where like these numbers are not going away, right? So we're kind of at that inflection point.
Well, it's like to your point, why does India even have a backlog in the unreserved category? The only reason is because the massive backlog from China. There wouldn't be. They would have enough visas to issue to all the past I-526 filers, not I-526E.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And
all right,
sorry, I'll just add to this is like at the same time, I don't want people to be like, oh well, maybe I shouldn't invest in the high unemployment category at all. You know, that is sure. I mean, if that's something that you care about, sure. The counter argument would be, if someone could make, is that, well, if I'm already inside the country, I get to enjoy my concurrent filing benefits.
Yep.
And still just wait 3, 4, 5 years to get my green card. I mean, I would love to know if you guys, based on looking at this data of cumulative petitions, is how long do you think perhaps it could take someone to actually get a green card? If you're if from China and you invest in a high unemployment project today, like, are we looking at a 2-year wait or a 5-year wait? That remains to be unknown. From the people that I've spoken to in the industry, they seem to know that there is the high chance of a backlog. They don't know how long it is, but they feel comfortable if their clients are here in the US, they do concurrent filing. And especially now, at least at this point of time, the investment period, the sustainment period is decoupled from the immigration process. So while that remains to be the case, maybe there are investors who will be okay with that and will continue to invest in high employment projects because, hey, for them, they'd rather invest in that deal than a rural one, but they're okay with getting their green card 4, 5, 6 years from now.
Yeah.
All
right, guys, let's just, why don't we do this? We'll keep some use cases for the end. What if this happens? What does it mean to me? Let's keep that towards the end. I just want to move on. Jeff, I want to get you in on this. So, we've heard all these experts go back and forth about all these different hypotheticals and all the numbers. What's the key takeaway? I mean, we're saying this is a more basic explanation, although it's a heavier looking chart, but what is your takeaway here, Jeff? What's the underlying message here if I'm a new investor?
I mean, the key takeaway is, I think, fairly obvious, and that is high unemployment EB-5 projects are much more likely to enter retrogression sooner than rural. And it is not by a measure of a small amount, but by a significant amount. So a lot of people, a lot of investors, a lot of EB-5 fundraisers need to take that in consideration when considering which project to go into or which project to invest in or bring to the EB-5 market. This is going to have a massive impact on the EB-5 industry going forward.
Okay, and rural, you're seeing there's a little bit of, let's say, oxygen left there, but then again, there's a definite, I guess, timeline to this. What's your takeaway on rural?
Rural, I mean, for the foreseeable future, seems to have breathing room, and the demand for rural is continuing to pick up. Another factor that we haven't talked about is the EB-5 process takes quite a long time for the investors to become aware, for agents to become aware, and they have already gotten this momentum going for rural. So that demand is going to just continue to grow. And right now, based on the supply numbers, there's no reason that that should subside.
Right. So the key question I have, based on what you guys see out in the marketplace, are there enough rural projects to, let's say, satisfy this appetite of this rising momentum for the time being? Are there enough rural projects that are hitting the market? Do you guys, are you guys involved with marketing rural projects at the moment? What's the situation there?
Well, firstly, there's no rising momentum just yet. There's no clear-cut rising momentum. Sure, maybe in the China side, we saw that big spike towards the end there. There is one, but there isn't like a concentrated effort of people switching over to rural. And there's still hesitation on that front. And also, I just play devil's advocate to something that was said earlier, which is that high unemployment could backlog sooner than rural. It could. It is at this point. We can say there's a backlog. There's an invisible backlog. We're just not going to see it in the visa bulletin because the agency isn't processing those petitions. And there is an argument to be made that there's way too many rural petitions that, let's just say a year and a half from now, and high unemployment, goes down. But those rural petitions get approved really quick, and those high unemployment petitions take forever to be approved, and then suddenly rural has a priority date for one or the other country.
You're exactly right, Ishaan. I mean, you're basically saying you could end up seeing a backlog in rural on the visa bulletin faster than urban, even though the backlog in urban is already likely it's possibly 4, 5, 6 years already for China and India. And you don't even see that reflective on the visa bulletin, possibly until 2026.
Yep. There's a lot, and Jeff, I mean, I'll play a little devil's advocate as well and be a little bit more pessimistic and say, I do think that the backlog for rural is kind of on its way. I don't think it's going to be for the foreseeable future that people can file willy-nilly into rural either. But if we get another 3-month count and it looks the way it does right now, I'm going to be shook. I'm going to be just absolutely shocked that people didn't make the switch over. And Ishaan's 100% right. I feel like we said this 6 months ago. We said, we should expect people to start switching over to rural. There's some clear benefits there on the immigration side of things. And yet here we are 6 months later, and that just didn't happen. That just did not happen at all. So let's see how the future unfolds. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, guys, we're gonna get new regulations in 2027, and it looks like we've got enough demand, at least in high unemployment, to carry us through 2027 already. Who knows what happens at that point, right? So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and ultimately, I'm not going to discourage anyone from filing into high unemployment or rural. But yeah, you definitely got to know what you're getting yourself into, and there's a lot of unknowns in the immigration space, especially in EB-5, that you're going to have to deal with. This is by far the most volatile visa category in the U.S., and it's not even close.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue into sort of all these projections. So you guys have already made some of these projections, which are reflected in this slide. But let me ask a basic question. What about, no one seems to be talking about pre-RIA investors. So maybe Ahmed, with your immigration attorney background, if somebody was there still, applied in 2019, maybe in those latter months, such as October, November, when there was a spike, what's the outlook for those people? If they were just doing a simple math, are they just then focused on the unreserved category? Can they be assured that the unreserved category is not being eaten into by post-RIA investors? What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think a lot of those questions are left unanswered, right? How does a rollover really work from RIA to unreserved, from set aside to unreserved? And we don't really have those answers, and I think we're going to start testing that in the next year for sure. Really good explanation by Brennan of how what one potential scenario for that is and how it could basically play out. It would help out a lot of investors now, but again, to Ishaan's point, it would hurt a lot of investors who are already in line, who have been in line for several years. And really that's what AIIA was established for, is to kind of help out those investors and give them some relief from their long wait times and kind of the burden that they've borne. But yeah, the single biggest issue for pre-RIA investors is adjudication times, right? If USCIS would just strap on their boots and allocate resources and do the things that are necessary to give those folks approvals, we could essentially clear out that backlog. I think that was kind of the point, right? The RIA created the situation where or the vast majority, 99% of filings were going to go into these set asides, and it created a static number in the unreserved category. And it's easier to clear a backlog that isn't continuously growing. So USCIS had an opportunity for 5 years to kind of go through that and make a huge dent, if not completely get through it. And here we are starting year 3, basically. And you know, we've barely made, you know, even a sizable dent in those numbers. So the single biggest issue, there are visas available. There's plenty of, there's a really good opportunity to get through it. And we've seen some of that actually go through. If you look at India on the visa bulletin, you'll see that they're almost current to RIA timeline for unreserved category, which means they've gotten through that big 2019 influx of filings and whatnot. But there's still so much work to be done. And really, in all this, like I just continue to feel bad for the Chinese investors who have been sitting and waiting for such a long time, and all that's preventing them from getting their green cards and living in America and you know, kind of starting their lives here. Is USCIS just kind of dropping the ball on adjudications.
Yeah. Well, and you still see that there's still a lot of people who have not been adjudicated from 2019. And so
correct.
You know, that could spike up the backlog again in India. But and it's sickening over the last couple of years how many visas have just gone to waste just because USCIS hasn't done their job and adjudicated past petitions. And so, but Sean, you bring up a very interesting point that's kind of a counter argument to what I was saying, is that but I kind of want to look at it from both sides. So if you're a past investor waiting in the backlog, you're saying, well, you created these set aside categories. Why are you issuing, you know, why would you issue unreserved visas to anyone that's in those set aside categories? You know, on the other side, you go, well, they created these set aside categories mainly for just China and India to be able to re-enter the market. I mean, that's really what it's for. And it's to incentivize, I mean, mainly it was Grassley who wanted rural investment. And so it's good. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with those. Now, realistically, each country should be allocated 7% of the total visa allocation per the law. So realistically, they should issue unreserved visas to investors from countries that hit their 7% cap within a set aside. But you know, you have to add Taiwan to the list of high unemployment categories that are already backlogged, because I mean, they have more applications than they have supply this year in the urban high unemployment category. So if they don't issue unreserved, that's another country that's already backlogged. And so it's just going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, how USCIS adjudicates past petitions, I-526 petitions, how quickly they adjudicate I-526E petitions going forward, and how they ultimately end up issuing the visas.
Well, guys, so towards this, I guess, final section, because we should really be looking to sort of round out this webinar. It's been a great discussion here for sure. But just, I want to take some subjective questions now, because, you know, we've been focused on all the numbers and all the what the numbers telling us. I have subjective questions for each one of you. So what I like to do now as my sort of last segue here is, you know, for each of the countries, the big countries, the big EB-5 contributor countries, what do you guys think, based on your individual discussions with investors from those countries? Is there maximum pain tolerance for being able to wait, you know, X number of years, you know, and still be satisfied with the program? So, you know, I know a lot of China, you guys talked about the PTSD with Chinese investors, and, you know, that party again began, but again, we're maybe at that point where some of the latter entrants in that party might start to see some suffering. So maybe I'll start with you, Brennan. China, what do you think is for the new post-RIA investor, and where their expectations are with higher amounts? What's their maximum pain tolerance for wait period now?
For a wait period, I mean, looking at these urban high unemployment numbers, it's so hard to put a number on it, because we don't know how many visas that will be lost from the set aside category this year and next year to the unreserved categories. The way that I'm seeing it, it looks like we're probably already at a 5-year backlog here for people who are filing after November from China, probably somewhere close to a little lesser than that for India. But we're probably already there. I think in rural, it doesn't look like there is, if you file today, it doesn't look like you're going to have a backlog. I agree, though, that's coming quickly. I think if you file probably in the second half of this year of 2024, sometime after June or so, you're probably going to see a little bit of a backlog if you're filing from China or maybe from India as well. And But it is so dependent. When that's going to happen is so dependent on how many visas get used this year. So
okay. Thanks. We'll go to India next, and again, I'll reframe my question and I'll pose this one to Ishaan.
I just want to clarify also, I do think it will take probably about 2 more years for rural, unless we just see a massive spike in rural investment and hardly any in urban over the next year. I mean, it's going to take rural a year and a half, 2 years before it catches up to the backlog that urban has.
Okay.
So
thanks.
I'll say this
again, Ishaan.
So I'll kind of say this. So yeah, for China, it kind of feels like for a high unemployment, it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on approval rates and all those other variables.
And how many other people are filing from around the world, right? How many of those other? Yeah, exactly. To your point.
Exactly. We don't even know what that rest of the world.
This is the 5-year number is if it stays static. If like next year we get like 400 rest of the world filings and high unemployment, it is mayhem for China and Indian filers, because they're literally going to get 70 per year for the foreseeable future, basically. So there's a lot of different things at play here.
That's 15 years for the current number of filings, not visas.
Correct. Not visas.
For filings, that could be a 45-year backlog.
I don't want to be that doomsday guy, but I mean, the rest of the world makes a huge difference for China and India in the high unemployment category.
And India is 390 petitions right now. That's the latest count that we have. Yeah. So and the worst case scenario for that could anywhere be between, again, like around 3 years ish. For Indian petitions to receive their green card, and that could also be again on the longer side, depending on things pan out. I will say though, I do see a lot of folks who do partial investments, and I see a lot of people taking risks with their source of funds and whatnot. And there's a high chance that a lot of those could also be denied. So it's possible that, all this doomsday stuff is probably never even happens, because there may be just a high rate of attrition. I remember when I did EB-5, the approval rate for Indians was around 70% way back in 2016, 17. I know at one point of time, it fell down to almost 40%. So there means 60% Indians being denied. So
nothing is more doomsday than getting your 526E denied. So I guess that's the worst case scenario, is you just you got a little too cavalier with your partial and ended up with a denial. But
yeah. All right, guys.
And just to round it up, I will say like that shouldn't mean necessarily. I know this slide over here says backlog for India and China at high unemployment is risky, but at the same time, like, for those investors out there, if you guys find a good high unemployment deal and you're okay with the possible wait time coming in, and as long as you know about it and it's disclosed to you by your issuer, your attorney, your agent, your broker dealer, then that's a great. I certainly hear a lot of stories about people who just weren't even aware of the facts before they invested, and that to me is the biggest sin in EB-5. The biggest takeaway that I can take away from this, that I would hope that everybody watching can, is that the visa bulletin is not an accurate estimate of how long it will take for you to get your green card. If a certain category has a priority date in front of it, do your homework. Chances are, even if you're watching this webinar 3, 4, 5 years from now, like, who knows what the data could be then, and who knows where the pending petitions will lie. There are invisible backlogs hidden in the visa categories. You got to do your research and make sure that you're making the best informed decision for you and your family.
The USCIS website is not up to date. It doesn't even have the correct regional center numbers, ID numbers on the approved regional center list. The wait times that it shows for investors is never correct. The wait times for petitions. I mean, it's great that you, Ishaan and Sean and AIIA are doing this, because investors need to know this information. And we saw this already happen between 2014 and 2018. And, people need to know what is going on here as we go into it again between now and the next couple of years.
Thank you so much, Ishaan and Sean and AIIA, for everything that you guys have done over the last 2 years. I don't think it can be understated how much of an impact you've had, not just on investors who are looking into, investing, but at the industry at large, and kind of the way that regional center operators are shaping their investments for the future and the way that stakeholders are looking at the industry at large. So thank you guys so much for the work that you're doing. It can't be said enough. And I really hope after watching this webinar and some of the other materials that Ishaan and Sean have released this week that people will donate and really support the organization, because it's very important.
All right.
Yeah, I could not
Thanks,
echo that
guys.
more.
Thank you.
Awesome.
One of the reasons why AIIA we do this is because, you know, a lot of, you know, I'm a past investor. I know when I was investing, you know, there were fragments of data being presented by different people that I talked to. So there was really no visibility. There was no organization like AIIA at the time that allowed for that, you know, data transparency to occur. And, you know, we were all disadvantaged from the investment decisions to make. Luckily for me, I was still on the right side of that, you know, speculative maybe assessment that I made at the time, that it was okay to invest with the amount of wait time that I had predicted at the time. But that was clearly not the case for thousands of investors. So it's really important with this work. You know, we're trying to make this a level playing field for all of the market participants in this industry to have access to the data and really make their life-changing decisions, you know, that are personal to them, beyond the numbers, beyond the financials, based on, you know, accurate data. So AIIA will continue to basically continue our FOIA series, as we call it, because that seems to be really the only way to get access to data from the USCIS. Although for anyone from the government watching this, you know, if USCIS could start voluntarily sharing this data, as I understand used to be the case many years ago, perhaps, that would be really a game changer. You know, some frequency at which, just like the visa bulletin numbers are being published every week by Department of State, I don't see the reason why, you know, periodic and frequent updates to this could not be made for the betterment of the industry. So we talked about the invisible backlog. You know, really, it's people have to sort of navigate, you know, the range of possibilities that we presented in the. But I think the good thing I feel about watching and hearing the experts today is that I think the range of possibilities is really well managed. It's something that most families that are making this decision for themselves should be able to calculate. And as somebody said, as long as you're aware of those and those things are disclosed to you and you still think this is the right thing to do, you know, absolutely, this presents the best opportunity to move to the United States. So yeah, so stay tuned. And just last plug here for AIIA, I just want to again highlight that, you know, all of this work would not be possible without financial commitments and support from many of our investor donors, as well as, you know, lately a lot of industry donors that have joined. So I wanted to thank everyone who's here with us today, because I know in some capacity, you know, you yourself or your organizations have felt like this is the right thing to do to support, you know, access to this data. So thank you very much for joining us. And thanks for the continued support that you provide to us, and the appeal to all those that are watching today that are not associated with AIIAs. Take a moment, go to our website, and if this webinar was useful to you, consider donating to us, and you know, just send us a message through Contact Us. We'll have an open discussion about what you guys are seeing and how perhaps we can help.
To learn more about the EB-5 program, the EB-5 investment process, or what AIIA is doing in the political sphere, please visit our website at goaiia.org. Check out our blog, check out our resources. We have tons of resources for both prospective and current investors. We also post very regularly about what we're doing in the political sphere to fight for investors' rights. So with that, we'll see you later.